Welcome to episode 2 of Skyrim Stories, the series in which I explore the lives of the most interesting and enigmatic individuals within the Elder Scrolls universe. Today, I'm going to be delving into the story of Nirn's most powerful mortal, the 4,000-year-old Dwemer wizard Divayth Fyr. And you heard me correctly, this elf is 4,000 years old. He is widely considered to be the most aged mortal on Tamriel, and he has certainly had an immensely interesting life so far. Before the emergence of what is now known as Morrowind, Resdayn was the most common term used to describe Tamriel's most northeastern province in the First Era. It was in this area that a group of religious exiles expelled from the Somerset Isles, called the Chimer, would come to settle. Divayth Fyr was born a Chimer in the First Era, not too long after initial settlement. Fyr was of House Telvanni, the so-called wizard house due to its strong affiliation with the magical arts. Resdayn at the time was ruled by a few so-called great houses, and House Telvanni was one such house. It comes as no surprise considering his magical upbringing that Fyr would later become the apprentice of the renowned Chimeri wizard Sothasil, before the latter achieved apotheosis and became one of the tribunal. With time, Divayth Fyr would become perhaps the greatest mortal sorcerer present on Tamriel. The natural magical ability of Divayth is perhaps proved by the fact the elf eventually became an apprentice wizard of the enigmatic and incredibly selective Psijic Order. Although he would eventually leave the institution due to fundamental disagreements with their doctrine, but this would not inhibit his magical career, rather in some ways it enhanced it. The young elf rejected the so-called old ways, the doctrine and form of magic that the order is based on, in favour of what he deemed the new ways, the ways of magic pioneered by the Dwemer. Resdayn was not solely inhabited by the Chimer at the time of Divayth Fyr's upbringing and young adulthood. The Dwemer coexisted with their fellow Mer, although the term coexist is somewhat stretched here, as the two peoples often warred. It's unknown what role Divayth Fyr had in the devastating war of the First Council between the Dwemer and Chimer that would herald the disappearance of the Dwemer and the transformation of the Chimer into the dour, dark-skinned Dwemer. At any rate, Divayth Fyr was certainly alive to witness this transformation, and he obviously experienced it himself. And considering his general alignment with the Dwemer's magical practices, it would be quite likely that Divayth simply abstained from the conflict, as he would abstain from most forms of politics in his later life. Divayth Fyr, like all Dwemer, had a fascination with the Daedric princes, considering them more worthy of worship than the Aedra. In the Second Era, he made a tour of the plains of Oblivion, gaining invaluable experience, and it's interesting to note that in the Third Era, he's in possession of 3 Daedric artifacts, the Saviour's Hide, Volundrung, and Scourge, which act as testimony to his knowledge of the Daedra themselves and his own power. For a brief period, he also possessed the Skeleton Key of Nocturnal, which he gained through foiling the plot of the Daedric Prince to take over the Clockwork City, but it's not clear if he still possesses this artifact. Divayth Fyr eventually settled at Tel Fyr, a sprawling tower of roots and bark on an island off the east coast of Vvardenfell. Here, he would set up his Corpus Arion, which would prove vital to the Nerevarines' effort to defeat Dagothr in the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind. The Corpus Arion was established by the Dwemer wizard to treat victims of the Corpus disease and to try and find a cure. The Corpus disease was manufactured by Dagothr, the antagonist of the third game, and the illness ultimately caused the subject to mutate into a zombie-like being unable to understand reason and bound to the will of Dagoth. Perhaps the most famous individual to have contracted this disease, other than the Nerevarine, was the last living Dwemer, Yagrum Bagan, who did not disappear like his kin, seemingly because he was in a different plane of existence at the time. Yagrum Bagan came to dwell in the Corpus Arion after contracting the deadly disease and became fast friends with Divayth. It's not surprising that the two got on so well, considering Divayth's admiration for the new ways. At the time of Skyrim in the 4th Era, it's unknown if Divayth Fyr is still alive. One can only speculate whether or not he survived the devastating eruption of Red Mountain, which destroyed much of Vvardenfell. In addition, the subsequent Argonian invasion following the disaster saw countless more Dwemer dead. Despite his power, it's not impossible to consider that the elf could have died in this conflict.